This is Lecture 9, the Auditory System, and it corresponds to Chapter 10 of the textbook, Sections 1 through 4, and not Section 5. Reminders and announcements. Just to reiterate, we're not going to cover Section 10.5 on the homework or the exam. Also, Exam 2 is now available on La Lima, and it's going to be due 11 p.m. on Sunday, 11/19. Just like Exam 1, you're going to have an hour to complete the exam, and this one is going to cover chapters 5 through 9, so it won't cover chapter 10 that you're reading this week. However, homework 10 will cover chapter 10, and that is due at the same time as the exam, so please plan carefully. As always, if you contact me at least a few days before the exam or the homework, I can give you an extension, but I don't give extensions on the day of or the weekend prior to the exam due date. Your recommended readings for this week are 2 New York Times articles that are related, and they're recent articles about the kind of controversy surrounding CTE, which is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. This is brain swelling and damage that occurs from concussions, and especially repeated concussions. And there's a lot of coverage about it right now, both in research and in popular news, about because a lot of research is finding that a lot of players, especially in the NFL, suffer these repeated concussions and have long-term brain injury that affects their behavior and their kind of emotional control as well. And so the first article is about Aaron Hernandez, who many of you are probably familiar with. I don't follow a lot of sports, but even I've heard of him. He was convicted of murder a while ago and died by suicide in his prison cell while he was, I think, undergoing an appeal for one of his murder charges. So they've recently released some of the findings of, they've examined Mr. Hernandez's brain, and I think he was only 27 when he died, but his brain was severely injured. He had severe CTE, especially in frontal areas, which, if you remember, is associated with impulse control, decision making, and as well in medial temporal structures, including the amygdala, and I believe the hippocampus was, or both hippocampi were damaged as well. So it kind of suggests that it's possible that some of the repeated concussions during his football career affected his brain in such a way that his behavior might have been affected as well. Now, I don't think they're trying to say that that his brain caused his history of aggressive behavior, because it seems maybe he kind of was aggressive and slightly violent anyway, but this might have exacerbated some of these situations. And the second article is a more general article about just widespread brain damage in NFL players. This research study had a sample of, I think, over 100 NFL players and found CTE in many of them, making their brains kind of look a lot older and more damaged than you would expect for people their ages. And I think it's this article that also notes that suicide and depression and a lot of psychological issues are more prevalent in retired NFL players, and research is examining right now whether there might be a link between CTE and concussions and some of these emotional issues later in life.
Okay, so starting on section 1, sound waves. Throughout this chapter, I'm going to be going back and forth a lot between language and music, just like your book. Language and music processing have a lot of similarities. Most of language functions are on the left side of the brain. Most of music functions are on the right side of the brain, and they use a lot of the same areas, just on opposite sides of the brain. Before we get into sound processing in the brain, a quick primer on sound waves. So sound waves are waves of changing pressure moving through a medium, which is typically air, and this propagates the sound, these waves of pressure. There are 3 physical properties of sound waves, that's frequency, amplitude, and complexity, and the auditory system codes each of these properties individually. Frequency is the first property of sound, and this is the number of cycles of a sound wave within a given period of time. One cycle is one peak and one trough within like a sine wave. So hertz is the way that we typically express frequency, and this is the number of cycles in a second. And higher pitch sounds have higher hertz values, which means more cycles per second. Lower pitch sounds have fewer cycles per second. And if you want to connect that to the different frequencies to actual sounds, you can follow this link. I recommend that. It's like a tone generator. It's going to tell you the frequencies of the tones you're hearing. Interestingly, if you have ever heard two musicians trying to tune or trying to match pitch, play the same pitch, what they're doing is trying to play tones with the exact same frequency. So if you look at this image in the middle with the blue and red sine waves or sound waves, these are two musicians that are out of tune on the top one. So the red musician is playing a slightly lower pitch. It's a slightly longer sound wave, right? A little bit more space between the sound waves. And once the two musicians are able to match the frequency or match the cycles of their sound waves, they're now in tune. They're playing the same note now. So different animals perceive different ranges of frequency. Humans perceive about 20 hertz to about 20,000 hertz. Dogs have a wider range than that. Frogs can't hear very much at all. Typical human voice is right in the sweet spot of where we detect frequencies. So our brains and our ears are particularly tuned to hearing the frequency values of the human voice, which ranges from about 85 to 255 hertz. Women typically have higher hertz values, higher notes or sounds in their voice, and men have a lower. And of course, kids tend to have in the higher range as well. Low frequencies actually travel better through water. So sound travels through water just like it travels through air in sound waves. So marine mammals will often have better hearing in the lower ranges. There's a concept called perfect pitch, which is the ability to recognize the frequency or the pitch of a note just out of the blue with no like tuning note or anything like that played beforehand. So somebody with perfect pitch could hear the sound of an alarm system and say that's an A, for example. They would be able to detect the exact frequency or the label that we've given that frequency. This is actually more common in speakers of tonal languages, which are languages where pitch variation distinguishes between words, languages like Vietnamese, Cantonese, Mandarin, where the same words sound with different pitch values or different frequency values can have different meanings. Amplitude is the next feature of sound, and this is the intensity of a sound stimulus. Amplitude is roughly equivalent to loudness. It's represented by the height of the sound wave, how tall the sound wave is, with higher amplitudes meaning what is a more intense stimulus or something that is perceived as louder, with lower amplitude being something that is perceived as more quiet. We measure amplitude of sound in decibels, which is the relative physical intensity of sounds. And the typical quietest sound a human can hear is 0 decibels. So decibels were created based off of the human hearing system. If something is less than 0 decibels, it doesn't mean that it doesn't create sound, it just means that humans cannot hear that sound. There's an online hearing test you can take here, but please note that it's not diagnostic. You need to go to a professional to get a diagnostic hearing test. This is just for fun. If you want to see how badly going to loud concerts has destroyed your hearing, you can check that out. Notably, loudness is a combination of the amplitude of sound waves plus our perception of the sound waves. So loudness can vary. The same sound can be loud or quiet depending on the person. So for example, or depending on the situation too. So for example, if you drop a water bottle in a silent lecture hall, that water bottle sounds a lot louder than if you drop a water bottle in a noisy lecture hall based on the relative noise around it. However, the actual amplitude or intensity of that stimulus would be the same in both of those scenarios. Complexity is the final feature of sound waves. This is the one that's most often overlooked. So complexity is how many different frequency waves make up a given sound. A pure tone is a sound with a single frequency, so it's low complexity. More complex tones have multiple frequencies. So if you look on the right here, you see this guy is playing the clarinet, and there are these many different waves, 2 through 20, that make up this very complex waveform from the clarinet. All the complex tones have a fundamental frequency. It's sort of what all of the component waveforms create and average out to, and that's the fundamental frequency. When we perceive complexity, this is called timbre, which is the quality or character of a sound. And that's how we perceive the complexity of the tone. So, for example, this image on the left that says waveform, in a tuning fork, we perceive the timbre of a tuning fork to be different from the timbre of a flute, because flute has different complexity. Same with a violin and a singer. The waveforms, the complex waveforms, all look different. And that sounds different to us. That gives these instruments the characteristic sound. That's complexity and timbre. So just to sum this up, there are 3 properties of sound waves: frequency, amplitude, and complexity. And then our perception of these 3 properties of sound waves are pitch, perception, and timbre. Frequency is the rate at which a sound wave cycles per second, so hertz values. Amplitude is the intensity of sound measured in decibels, and that's how high or low the wave is, the sound wave is. And then complexity is how many different frequencies create one single sound. There are additional subjective properties of sound. In language, we often hear variations on a sound as having the same meaning. So the same word in different accents still has the same meaning. For example, in Minnesota, they say bag, and then in my Midwestern English, I say bag. And I perceive those 2 words, although they sound quite different, as being the same, having the same meaning. Language and music are processed differently than other types of sounds. So the door closing has, the sound of a door closing has a certain meaning, but language and music need additional processing because they have complex meaning. Language and music are both used for communication. They contain many, many pieces of information in very short periods of time and require quick and efficient and rather expert processing. Speech and music, or language and music, are lateralized. So as I mentioned before, language is lateralized to the left side of the brain, music is lateralized to the right side of the brain, and this is typically the case, and I'll get into that later. This is in the average brain. Most people's brains are lateralized in this way. As well, humans have a really large capacity for both language and music, and there's a good deal of evidence that suggests our brains have evolved to have a large capacity for acquiring language and music. So section 2, functional anatomy of the auditory system. We're going to go into the pathway of sound, but roughly sound waves are collected by the ears and then transferred through the ear, through several parts of the ear and the inner ear, and this turns sound waves into mechanical energy and then turns the mechanical energy into neural signals. These neural signals travel through the brain stem to the auditory cortex and to different regions of the auditory cortex. The brain systems for sound processing are closely related to the brain systems for sound production. We'll get into that in a bit. This is an overview of the processing of sound in the ear. So we have the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. In the outer ear, sound waves are caught by the pinna, which is this outer part of this fleshy outer part of your ear, and the external ear canal, and these sort of act as a funnel and funnel the sound into your in toward your ear. The external ear canal amplifies the sound and directs it to the eardrum. The eardrum vibrates, so it's literally like a drum in the sense that it vibrates according to the frequency of the sound waves that are coming in and the middle ear catches those sound waves. So the middle ear detects the vibration frequencies of the eardrum. The middle ear is actually a chamber, and it's filled with air. And inside are these 3 tiny little bones that have official names, but they also sort of look like a hammer, an anvil, and a stirrup. So often they're called that. So these little bones called ossicles, tiny little fragile bones, connect the eardrum to an opening in the cochlea of the inner ear. So if you've heard of cochlear implants, cochlear implants are trying to replicate the cochlea. Cochlea is kind of extremely important part of hearing. And the ossicles amplify the vibrations in the eardrum to make the sound more sensitive for the cochlea. So moving on to the inner ear is really where all the action happens in terms of sensory reception in the auditory system. This contains the cochlea, which means snail. It also means something like screw in Greek, because it's sort of snail-shaped and it's maybe like twists around like a screw. This contains the auditory receptor cells. So the outer ear and the middle ear have really just been funneling the sound and amplifying the sound in order to get to the inner ear where actual sensory reception is happening. The cochlea is filled with fluid compartments, and these compartments are separated by the basilar membrane. Embedded in the basilar membrane are hair cells, and at the tip of the hair cells are cilia. Cilia of the outer hair cells are in contact with the tectoral membrane, and vibrations cause these membranes to bend, which stimulates the cilia at the top of the hair cells, or the tips of the hair cells. There are 2 types of hair cells. Both are connected to the basilar membrane. There are outer and inner hair cells. Outer hair cells are also attached to the tectorial membrane. They contract or relax to change the stiffness of the tectorial membrane. And the inner hair cells are loosely touching the tectorial membrane, but they're not connected. So the cochlear fluid flows based on vibrations that have come from the outer and middle ear. The basilar membranes and tectoral membranes fluctuate. This stimulates the hair cells, the cilia on the hair cells, which moves the hair cells. This creates depolarization in the cells, which we know creates action potential. So this is what creates the nerve impulses, is this flow of the fluid, stimulates the hair cells, moves them around, and creates nerve impulses. Different frequencies can actually cause different responsiveness in different parts of the basilar membrane. So this is how our brain encodes different frequencies, which, if you remember, is something like pitch. So different notes or different tones, high and low notes. Higher frequencies or higher tones cause more resonance at the base of the cochlea. So this is, you can see down in the uncoiled image of the cochlea, in the like really highest range of what we can hear. 20,000 is at the base of the cochlea. 20,000 hertz is at the base of the cochlea. It's sort of narrow and thick in this region. And then lower frequencies are picked up more in the apex or the top of the cochlea, and it's kind of thin and wide in this region. The pathway from the ear to the auditory cortex is rather complex. I'm going to give you a more simplified version than the book gives you. I don't expect you to know every single detail, but just know the general pathways. So within the inner ear, the inner hair cells synapse with bipolar cells. If you remember, bipolar cells are also in the retina of the visual system. So we see bipolar cells kind of showing up in 2 different sensory systems. Bipolar cell axons bunch together and create the auditory nerve, which is also known as the cochlear nerve. Part of this auditory nerve actually branches off and forms the auditory vestibular nerve as well, which is responsible for balance and hearing. So if you've ever heard of someone having like an inner ear disorder and it gives them vertigo or difficulty with balance, this is why it's the inner ear is associated as well with the vestibular system. The auditory nerve projects to both the same side of the brain and the other side of the brain. So for example, the auditory nerve that's coming out of the left ear is going to project to the left side of the brain. It's also going to send some projections to the right side of the brain. Same with the right auditory nerve. It's going to project both to the right side of the brain and then send some projections to the left side of the brain as well, so that auditory information is being processed. Auditory information from each ear is being processed on both sides of the brain. Okay, so the auditory nerve goes through the hindbrain. The auditory information goes to the midbrain then, and then to the thalamus, specifically to the medial geniculate nucleus, and then it goes to the auditory cortex. So we're seeing some similarities between the visual system and the auditory system. The visual information, you probably remember, had rather complex pathways, but also went through the thalamus to a different nucleus in the thalamus, and then went to the visual cortex. Similarly, auditory information goes through the thalamus and the auditory cortex. Within the auditory cortex, which is in the temporal lobe, so auditory cortex is temporal lobe on both sides of the brain. Primary auditory cortex, also known as A1, is surrounded by the secondary auditory cortex, known as A2. For right-handed and left-handed people, there can actually be differences in the lateralization of the brain. Lateralization of function is when a function is located primarily on one side of the brain versus the other, and this is the case for both language and music. So for most right-handed people, which is the majority of the population, Wernicke's area is part of the secondary auditory cortex on the left side of the brain, and the corresponding area on the right side of the brain specializes in analyzing music. However, for 15% of people who are left-handed, this hemispheric asymmetry is flipped. So for 15% of lefties, the Wernicke's area, which you remember is a language area, is on the right side of the brain, and area specializing in analyzing music is on the left side of the brain. For 15 additional percent of lefties, language function of the Wernicke's area is actually bilateral, so they have language functions on both sides of the brain. For the remaining 70% of lefties, they have lateralization similar to right-handed people. Wernicke's area is on the left side, music analysis is on the right side. Moving on to section 3, neural activity and hearing. So hearing pitch. Pitch, as you just learned, is the different perception of different frequencies of sound waves. And we also just talked about how different frequencies are coded in different parts of the basilar membrane, with higher frequencies being coded toward the base of the cochlea and lower frequencies being coded toward the apex of the cochlea. So each hair cell on the basilar membrane only responds to a range of frequencies. So they, kind of like how cones in the retina only respond to certain wavelengths of light. So if you remember from the visual system, some cones only respond to like red light or green light. They have specializations. Similarly, the sensory receptor cells of the auditory system, hair cells, only respond to a certain range of frequencies. And these frequency ranges are processed separately all the way through the primary auditory cortex, so all the way through the hindbrain and the midbrain, the thalamus, and to the auditory cortex. There's still separate areas of the auditory cortex for processing, the primary auditory cortex for processing different Hertz values. And they're kind of in order too. Cochlear implants work by stimulating areas of the basal membrane in the same way that sound waves would. So it literally is just trying to replicate what is happening in parts of the ear that are no longer working by stimulating those areas of the basilar membrane. So often hair cells in people who have acquired deafness, hair cells are damaged and they're no longer picking up on different frequencies, so cochlear implants can stimulate those areas of the basal membrane and sort of replicate what sound waves would normally do and hair cells would pick up on. In terms of detecting loudness, we talked before how loudness is the perception of intensity or the amplitude, the height of sound waves. Cochlear bipolar cells pick up or code for the intensity or amplitude of sound waves by firing at a greater rate. So the louder stimulus is, the bipolar cells are firing more quickly. We detect location in part from hearing, so we can tell from roughly what part of the environment around us the sound is coming from, and this is detected in a number of ways. One is the interaural time difference, which means the difference in time between when a sound hits, for example, the left ear versus the right ear. So if I have a sound stimulus on my right side, it's hitting my right ear first and then it's hitting my left ear, and it's a very small difference in time, but our brain can actually detect that and figure out that the sound is on my right side because of that difference. When a sound is on my right side, it's also going to be a little bit louder, and this is interaural intensity difference, the difference in loudness between the sound of the ears. And again, it's a very small difference, but our brain is very sensitive and can pick up on these differences and estimate that the sound is on the right side of my environment. Section 4, Anatomy of Language and Music. Music, it's always hard to tell looking retrospectively, but it appears that music may have evolved at the same time as language in the modern human brain. The same general areas of the brain in the left and the right are allocated to language and music, which indicates that these functions may have developed at the same time. There's a really famous flute artifact that was found in Slovenia in Europe that's estimated to be from around like 43,000 to 82,000 years old. And where it was found in Slovenia and also the time period suggests that it was made by Neanderthals. And fascinatingly, somebody who kind of like reconstructed the flute and found out that it played what is close to a major scale in our Western European scales, but it actually was off one note, so one note was a little bit down, which makes it close to a jazz scale. So it might have actually been a jazz scale where the third of the scale is lowered. Which might mean, and this is a lot of conjecture, but it might mean that Neanderthals were playing music that was something close to what we would think of as jazz intonations. Language structure appears to be innate to humans, and there's a number of reasons to believe this. This idea was first kind of propagated by this guy Noam Chomsky, and then a little bit later by this linguist Steven Pinker, who I believe are both still alive. Noam Chomsky's this guy on the right, Steven Pinker is this kind of wacky looking dude with the curly hair. So one reason to believe that language structure is innate in humans is that in the 5,000 to 7,000 different languages that are in use by humans today, these languages all seem to be fundamentally very similar. So all of these languages have nouns, verbs, direct and indirect objects, despite the fact that many of them evolved quite separately from each other. Another reason to believe that language structure is innate to humans is that children are not actually explicitly taught how to speak, at least not typically. They just pick it up, and they pick it up very quickly. So we learned in a previous chapter that there are these sensitive periods of language acquisition, which is typically like 1 year to 6 years old, although children are learning things about language previous to 1 year. And the brain is primed to absorb this information and learn language during this time. We learned as well that if a child is not exposed to language during this time, during this very specific period of brain development, they are not typically able to develop, or pretty much not able to develop fluency in a language after that. Another reason to believe that language structure is innate to humans is the case of pidgin languages developing into Creole languages. So Pidgin is a simplified language that's created from 2 or more formal languages, so something like French and Spanish. It's like a hybrid simplified language that's created from these formal languages. And then Creole is a language that's developed from a Pidgin language that becomes formalized and then native to a group of people. So Creole languages are typically created when a pidgin language is being spoken to a child within a given setting, and that sort of cohort of children who hear this pidgin language develop this Creole language. And the children are not exposed, the children who are exposed to the pidgin language are not exposed to formal language structures because it's this simplified language, but they create formal language structures in the same way that that we would have formal language structure in something like English. And so Hawaiian Pidgin is an example of this. Hawaiian Pidgin is actually a misnomer. Hawaiian Pidgin is a Creole language that was formed from an original Pidgin language influenced by Hawaiian, English, Cantonese, Portuguese, and other languages. And it's a formalized language now that was developed by the children of people who spoke the actual original Pidgin language. Language is localized in several areas of the brain, mostly in this parietal frontotemporal area. Many language functions are localized, but not all of them. So we're just going to talk about these specific areas that seem to be specialized to language. As we talked about before, for most individuals, particularly right-handed people and about 70% of left-handed people, language is lateralized in the left hemisphere. So we talked about Wernicke's area, which is associated with the interpretation of sound. Wernicke's aphasia is when there's a lesion to the Wernicke's area and the individual cannot comprehend or produce meaningful speech, but they can produce spoken words fluently. The words they produce are just meaningless. Just a reminder, aphasia means any sort of inability to produce or understand language. And then we talked about Broca's area, which is in the frontal lobe, and it's kind of in this frontal region, right in front of the motor cortex. It works alongside the part of the motor cortex that's responsible for facial motor functions. Broca's area appears to store the motor programs for words, so we're going to talk about motor programs a bit in the motor function section that's coming up in future weeks, but just generally any motor activity has sort of a program or a set of instructions, and language is no different. Language, different words require specific motor functions, and that is stored in Broca's area. As we learned in a previous chapter, Broca's aphasia is when an individual can understand speech but can't produce spoken words, and this results from a lesion or some other injury to Broca's area in the frontal lobe. There are additional areas that are, again, typically lateralized to the left hemisphere that are also associated with language functioning. The supplemental speech area, which is a speech production area in the left frontal dorsal cortex, and then these areas controlling facial movement or sensation in the motor cortex and somatosensory cortex. There's this interesting case study that I think your book brought up, where an individual had to have almost all of her left hemisphere removed, and in the process lost almost all of her language comprehension and production. I think she could produce like one sentence. However, she could still recognize songs and sing the words. She couldn't create new songs or learn new songs, and she couldn't understand the meaning of messages that were sung to her, but she still just remembered sort of the production of the words of these songs and could sing melodies, which is kind of an interesting case study, and it's kind of a profound example of how music ability can be retained to some degree, even with a complete removal of the majority of the language areas in the brain. In processing music, the same general areas that are used in language processing in the left hemisphere are used for music processing in the right hemisphere, again, for most people. So if you look at this first row of brains, you can see the red areas are areas that are used in speech production and understanding speech, discriminating speech sounds. And then for similar functions in music, the same areas, the same general areas, are used for similar functions in music. So the area that discriminates speech sounds on the left hemisphere is used for comparing pitches in the right hemisphere. The one for listening to words in the left hemisphere is used for listening to melodies in the right hemisphere, etc. Just as language and the structure of language appears to be innate to humans, so does perceiving and creating music also appear to be innate to people. Our brains appear to be designed for this ability based on the number of areas that are designed for it. Amusia is an inability to differentiate musical notes. So this is, we might call more colloquially tone deafness. This affects about 4% of the population, and it's kind of analogous to aphasia. So aphasia is to language as amusia is to music. If you think you might be tone deaf, you might already know that, but if you want to find out, there's this test that takes maybe 5 minutes where it will tell you to what degree you may or may not be tone deaf. The kind of one of my favorite case studies in music processing is the case of Maurice Ravel, who is a French composer in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He was a composer and rather prolific during the majority of his life. He had, toward the end of his life, this degenerative medical condition. Your book mentions briefly that they mentioned it as a stroke, but this is actually, it's more likely that it was something like Alzheimer's or another type of dementia called frontotemporal dementia that affects the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. But regardless of what the condition was, it caused a progressive aphasia, so over time it created decreases in his language ability. His music perception was intact. He could still hear music and understand music, but his auditory memory and auditory imagery, so hearing music in his head, was still intact. But he couldn't read or write music, and he couldn't play the piano any longer. He was a composer, so playing the piano was a integral part of composing songs. Kind of in the process, so toward the end of his life, he composed this piece called Bolero, which is one of his best known pieces. If you like, you can follow the link either to a London Symphony Orchestra doing the first one, or a brass ensemble playing Bolero. And this piece is characterized by this unusually repetitive rhythm and melody. So even if you don't read music, you can see down at the bottom there's this rather simple rhythm, and it's repeated over and over and over again for this piece, which can be as long as 14 minutes. The same rhythm is being repeated on a drum. And similarly, there's this melody, which is just a couple bars long, that is also being repeated by different instruments and in different ways throughout this entire piece. People have looked back and believe that Bolero, the unusual repetitiveness of this piece, which is kind of why it's so well known, might have actually been due to the disorder, the degenerative disorder that Ravel was suffering from. So in Alzheimer's dementia and frontotemporal dementia, there's a symptom called perseveration, which is an obsessive repetition of actions or words. And they think that this repetitive rhythm and the repetitive melodies might have actually been a symptom of this degenerative disorder that Ravel was suffering from. Interestingly, there's this anecdote that's not clear if it's completely true or not, but people say that at the first performance of Bolero, a woman shouted out that Ravel was mad, and Ravel was said to have later stated that she must have truly understood the piece. Just kind of a cute anecdote about him. And then finally, music therapy. I know a number of you are interested in music therapy, and this is a growing field. It has been implicated by pretty preliminary research, but research nonetheless, that it can improve motor disorders, improving gait and arm training after stroke, can improve aphasia, so the ability can help with the ability to discriminate speech sounds, can help in mood disorders, improving and stabilizing mood. Autism spectrum disorders, it may improve communication, joint attention, or two people paying attention to the same thing, increasing social engagement by playing musical instruments together, and also just enhancing auditory processing, which can be dysfunctional in people with autism spectrum disorders. And then in pain, there's indication that people who experience especially chronic pain, there can be decreases in chronic pain with the use of music therapy. I'll probably send out a message about this later too, but if anyone's interested in music therapy, I have a contact of someone who is in music therapy in the field right now, and she would be happy to speak with anybody who's interested in music therapy.